Good morning and welcome to the Point. Well, we now are at the end of week 2 of the Trump administration. The divisions in Washington are becoming more and more evident, and we continue to watch as we see what happens with Trump's cabinet nominees. That's something we'll be following very closely in the coming week, and next week on this show, we want to take a deeper look into what's really going on in Washington and how it could impact you. But this morning, closer to home, in Lansing, one of the first things that the legislators there will have to deal with is a new budget. The Senate Appropriations Chair, Dave Hildenbrand, is the senator from Lowell. Recently, we sat down with him to talk about that process and just exactly where those spending priorities may be. Senator, it's a new year, and one of the biggest issues, as always, for the legislature will be budgeting, and that's really where you come in as the chairman of the Appropriations Committee over in the Senate. But before we get there, I want to talk about something that's made headlines, perhaps unnecessarily, but let's talk about this. In the Senate and in the House, 2 separate plans from Republicans to, in one way or another, do away with the state's income tax, which is at 4.25. Most people, including me, couldn't get that at 4.25. The plan over in the House, at least, would take 40 years to roll out and completely do away with the income tax. At the same time, Democrats have resurrected the idea of a graduated income tax, more like what we pay at the national level, depending on your level of income. Do any of these plans have a chance of coming to fruition?
I think so. Tax relief, I think, is a conversation that we have to have. And I've always been supportive of looking at opportunities to give more back to the taxpayers. Our state now is in a position, because our economy is stabilized, we're seeing slow growth, steady growth in the revenues coming into our state. Our 2 biggest revenue producers, our revenue generators are our income tax, which is number 1 as far as revenue generating, and then sales tax is number 2. Those have all both been fairly steady, and so I think it's the appropriate time to have that conversation. Now, I will say, I don't want to jeopardize the strength and the foundation that we've built in the state budget. We obviously have some great programs that we have to provide to the citizens of Michigan, and I don't want to jeopardize that. But I think in concert with the budget process that we're about to embark on, it's very important that we also have that conversation of, is this the right time? And what would some sort of tax relief look like for the hardworking taxpayers of Michigan?
Let's examine that a little bit, because you talk about income tax being the chief revenue generator, and I realize that, or I anticipate that if there is some action, that the income tax isn't just going to go away overnight, because that would be a shock to the economy of the state. But let's talk about the dollars and cents. How many dollars are we talking about generated from income tax, roughly?
Almost $10 billion annually.
Now, that is out of a $56 billion overall state budget. More than half, a little more than half of that federal money?
Less than half, just under less than half is federal. About 42% is federal dollars that come into the state. About 58% is state-generated tax revenue.
So when you talk about $10 billion, and a fair amount of that is, I assume, that money is split between general fund and general purpose.
Majority is the general fund for the income tax.
And when you talk about GFGP, that is, I always explain it, that's everything you expect a government to do. I mean, that takes care of state government operations, takes care of state police, all those different activities. They may have some other pieces here and there, but a lot of that comes out of the GFGP. So would the plan be to somehow find an alternative stream of revenue over a period of time to replace that, or simply let that go away and hope that revenues elsewhere grow enough that wouldn't be a big constriction on the state function?
Well, I have a lot of reservations with completely getting rid of the state's income tax. Now, what I will say is we have opportunities, and I think there's opportunities for tax credits where they're more one-time, so you can monitor the health of the revenues and the condition of the state budget on an annual basis, and as you have extra revenue, you give it back in more of a one-time or two-time deal back to the taxpayers of Michigan. So you still have the framework of a tax structure together, and in good times you have an opportunity to give some tax credits back to the taxpayers, and in tough times you still have that framework where you have the ability to provide the necessary services to the people of Michigan.
All right, I think this is a conversation you and I will have more on as this year goes by, but let's start talking about the budgeting process, because that starts right away. The governor will lay out his budgeting plan here in the next few weeks, I assume?
Yeah, early February, February 8th.
Okay, so as we take a look at that, then we move forward to the next process, which is the legislative prerogative. Where are we dollars and cents wise? Because we always report, and I'm always skeptical to say, oh, well, there was a surplus. Well, there's never a surplus. It's just money that hasn't been spent yet. And so the revenues ended up a little better last fiscal year than expected, right?
Yeah, revenues, like I said, are up a little bit. They're steady. So, we won't have to do any major cutting through programs, but we'll embark in that process. And it's an involved process. It takes a lot of planning and coordination. I've enjoyed it greatly over the years in my role as the Senate Budget Chair, and we'll move through the process. We have a number of new House members because of the election last fall that will be joining appropriations, so I'll be getting to get to know those new members and beginning to work through the process. So I think overall we're in a pretty good place. I have three principles that guide me through this process. One is to make sure that we get the budget done in a timely fashion and make sure we have a balanced budget. And we've been able to do that the last 6 years, and I want to continue to do that. Secondly is to make sure we have an open and transparent budget process. I want to make sure that everything we do is done so the public can view it, the media can view it, and so we're very open and transparent and the public can see what we're doing. And then finally, I want to make sure that we look for any opportunities for savings and efficiencies. When you talk about a $54 or $55 billion budget that's been around for a long, long time for a state government, there's opportunities to do things better. And so I'm always looking to creative ways to streamline things we do, find efficiencies, make government work better for the people. So I'll be really charging the committee that I'm honored to chair and the work that I do in that area as well. So.
When you start in this budget process, you have the larger budget group, and then you have the individual subcommittees that each have their area of expertise that they deal with. And over in the Senate, as you accurately point out, most, if not all, members have been dealing with this budget for a while. Over in the House, where you have about a third turnover every couple of years, it's kind of a big learning curve, and that is in no way being saying anything about the incoming members. It's just an interesting process because it's not necessarily the way budgets are done in the private sector, because you've got this, what do you say, 42% of federal money coming in that you really don't get to say how that is spent, right?
Right.
So that's more or less fixed, and so everything else that has to be paid for has to be carved out of the rest, and that's a little bit different process.
Yeah, it is. Most of it is, the federal dollars are earmarked dollars, and primarily that's in our health care, our social services, our food assistance. We do get some federal money for roads and bridges. We get federal money, some for schools and public education as well. So it's sprinkled in throughout the budget, and like you pointed out, we have most of that is pretty earmarked as far as exactly how we spend it. And then the rest is we have a little bit more flexibility, and that's where we focus most of our time. It's that general fund that's roughly about $10 billion that funds a lot of state government, and that's where we have the opportunity to have the most flexibility and really prioritize that spending to reflect the needs of our state.
Well, there are two things I want to talk about next, and let's start with education, because you're talking about $10 billion that goes to fund government, but there is the school aid fund as well. And this year that's around
About $14 billion.
And that money is dedicated money that also does, well, some can come out of the general fund, but it is a dedicated form of money. And that is always, and I mean always, a point of contention. There are always factions that say we must spend more money on schools, and the governor has said we need to spend more money on school debt, which is something that's been going on for the last 6 years. So what does that argument look like when you get started? Because it becomes a very big line item overall, and I think most people would agree that education should be a priority, but how do you balance the spending towards what goes into a classroom today versus what has been in a classroom 15 years ago, and you still have those obligations to pay?
Yeah, we have prioritized public education funding since I've been in this role. And since I've actually served in the legislature, we've been able to increase funding there. Of course, sometimes it seems like you can never do enough, but I remind people that 70 to 80% of a school budget is labor. So when you talk about investing in our schools, it's about the people who provide the service, and so that comes down to salary, wages, and benefits. And so there are a lot of things that we need to do to make sure that we're providing those salaries and benefits in an appropriate way, in a cost-effective way. And so there are changes that we will be discussing as part of that spending. What reforms can happen in the benefit side of things to provide great benefits for those men and women who work very hard in our schools, but provide them in a cost-effective way. So those conversations will continue to happen as we move through the budget.
Education spending, of course, is always one of those areas where Republicans and Democrats have disagreements. When we come back, more on some of the ideas that Governor Snyder brought to the table when he was first elected. That's all next. To the Point. Welcome back to the Point. This morning, our conversation with the Senate Appropriations Chairman, Dave Hildenbrand. He's a Republican senator from Lowell. We're talking to him about financing education. And some of what we talked about was what Governor Snyder brought to the table. So walk me through this. Part of the governor's plan when he came in was to put more money into the retirement benefits accounts. And I think his plan is to have that paid in full by 2036. That's been
2038, I believe.
38. So that's been kind of the mantra. So those are liabilities, unfunded liabilities that have been accrued by school districts around the state, and that's part of where this money is going. That's one part of it. What you're talking about is changing those benefits and retirements going forward. That too becomes controversial.
It does. I've been one who has been pushing to move new public school employees into a defined contribution plan. It is very controversial, but I think that's the modern way to provide retirement benefits for public employees. All legislators are on a defined contribution plan. All state employees now, hired after 1997, are on a defined contribution plan. A lot of local government employees are also on those plans. So it's the way, it's the future of retirement plans, and it's just how we get there, I guess, is the debate that we have to have. Pensions have bankrupted large cities like Detroit. Pensions have bankrupted large employers like General Motors. They're benefits that were promised decades ago without a plan of how to pay for them. So at that time, they were promised to people without a plan to pay for them, and that to me is irresponsible. And I think we need to make the adjustment, make the shift into a modern retirement plan for the future.
So that's a big part of the spending for the state, and one that you'll be looking at, and of course the people that are directly in control of that budget will be looking at, and that conversation could create some heated debate in Lansing, as it normally does. But there's a second issue that is also a big ticket item, and you were talking about this in the federal pass-through, or the federal money that comes in, and that's about health care cost. And because of the debate that's going on in Washington right now, the expansion of Medicaid in the state of Michigan and the Affordable Care Act and all of that, while not perhaps immediately in question, are uncertain going forward. So nobody pretends to know what's going to happen, what kind of a replacement, if one happens, a repeal, if that happens, when that's going to happen. But let's just start for a minute by that expansion of Medicaid. What does that mean to the state of Michigan? Because early on that was a federal government cost, but then it starts shifting back to the state.
It did. Yeah, our Medicaid expansion program, which was authorized through the Affordable Care Act, is now insuring almost 600,000 Michigan residents who are getting their insurance through the program that we named it Healthy Michigan. I wasn't a big fan of it at the time. I had a lot of concerns about the costs and if this was the right way to provide health care to people in Michigan. I would prefer them to be on private health care and find ways to make private health care more affordable or more accessible to more people. But having said that, it did pass the legislature. It was put into law about 4 years ago, and now people have been utilizing those health care benefits for a number of years. The question becomes, and all of that for the first 3 years was paid for by the federal government, almost $2 billion a year from the federal government to pay for those 600,000 people for their health care costs. Now the state is starting to participate some. I think now we're paying about 5%, and it's going to gradually go up to about 10% that the state will be responsible for. So the question in all of our minds is, we're glad that these folks are getting health care and the federal government is paying for the majority of it, but what do we do if they say, you still need to provide this health care, but we're going to reel back on some of the costs that we're going to cover. So then that puts us in a tough spot financially. So we're obviously concerned about what's going to happen. I think there's a lot of opportunities maybe to make the program better. So we're kind of waiting and see to see what happens at the federal government level. And like you said, it's hard to tell with a new president and new Congress exactly what is going to happen, but there's no question that there's an interest to repeal the Affordable Care Act and replace it with something else. And as soon as that's done, we'll begin to act to prepare Michigan for those changes.
Give me your take. I mean, you've been dealing with this budget for a long time, not just in the House, not just in the Senate, but you've been around state government for a while, and you know how this process works. So you don't know what's going to happen today, but as you go into these budget preparations for the next fiscal year, which will start in October, and I should point out, because you've been doing kind of a rolling 2-year budgeting, you've got some of that kind of in place, but you have to at least be prepared. I'm not saying you guess, but you have to be prepared for that eventuality. So you have to have some flexibility going forward because of that uncertainty.
No question about it. And that's why as we talk about the tax relief piece of it, that's why I say it's so important that we have to do that in concert with the state budget process. That way we're looking at the pressures we have in spending, the changes that are going on at the federal level, other needs of our state. We need to balance that with what kind of tax relief we can get, so we're not jeopardizing the structurally sound and a solid foundation that we've built for the state budget over the last 5 or 6 years, that we're not jeopardizing that. So that's why it's important to me as we have these budget talks, which is primarily a spending conversation, we have to have them in terms of the revenue as well, which includes any sort of tax relief conversation that we would have.
As you move forward in this process, we talked about a couple of big line items when you talk about healthcare and when you talk about education. One of the things, and this has been talked about maybe as a cost-saving idea, but maybe more as a philosophical issue and one of logic, and that's criminal justice reform. But criminal justice, and particularly the prison system in this state, not inexpensive. It's still a big chunk of cash. So is that going to be something that is resurrected in this legislature?
I think it will be, yeah. The prison system in Michigan, we are responsible for about 45,000 people who are criminals in our state who have been a danger to society. They've been put in our prisons. We manage 30-some prisons around our state and are responsible for this 45 or 46,000 prison population. So it's an important entity. It's expensive, but the population has been going down. In good times, when the economies are better, you have less crime because people have economic opportunities. And so we've been seeing those numbers come down. We actually were able to close one of our old facility in northern Michigan that was going to require a decent amount of capital costs, but we were able to close it and consolidate some of those services in some of the other prisons. We'll have the conversation about what's been coined kind of presumptive parole or balancing re-entering people back into society in a more timely fashion. Now, I'm always concerned. We want to be very careful as you go down that road. We want to make sure our communities are protected, our neighborhoods are safe, so we don't want to be releasing people that are going to be a danger to society and a danger to our state and our families. So we'll have that conversation again, but I think you have to be very careful as you go down that road that we're not letting people out of prison who are going to be a danger to society.
On a different segment of society who have a much different background, people who have served this country honorably and well, you in the last session made some pretty big changes to the way the veterans homes, first of all, the veterans homes, the Jacob Ellie Center and the Grand Rapids Home for Veterans as we know it, and that may not be all because the system may be expanding. You made some pretty significant changes. Let's talk about what you're doing and what you and your colleagues have decided to do going forward with these homes.
Well, the state owns and operates 2 veterans homes. The ones you mentioned, there's one in the Upper Peninsula in Marquette, Michigan, and then the one in Grand Rapids. And they were built back in the late 1800s, so they've been around a long time. It was a oversight structure that was set up that just is no longer working. That's why we've seen some major problems at both of the homes, primarily in Grand Rapids, about the quality of care and questions about how we're going to provide good care in the future for our state's veterans. So I worked for a number of years to put together a team. We put together some recommendations and were able to get it through the legislature. Well, we're kind of hitting the reset button. We're going to have a new authority that will be appointed pretty quickly this year in early 2017 who will begin to plan for the future of our state's veterans homes. We've already appropriated and we're applying to the federal government to build 2 new homes, a brand new home in Grand Rapids on the existing site where the home is. It'll be modernized, it'll be smaller, it will provide better care for our veterans. There'll be an additional home built in the Detroit area. What we found is a lot of veterans are housed at the Grand Rapids Home for Veterans. They're miles and hours away from family and friends. They don't see a lot of visitors, and as we all know, part of a good quality care is seeing your loved ones, and they're just not getting a lot of visitors. So we'll be able to build a new home in the Detroit area and house our veterans there close to their family and friends. And that'll also be a modern facility with all the amenities, which I think the brave men and women who served our country deserve.
And to be clear, when you say smaller home, somebody's going to say, well, wait a minute. Part of the reason for the smaller home in Grand Rapids is because you will have a facility for the people in Southeast Michigan, a larger population center, obviously, and people want to stay closer to their families, so there won't be as much pressure on the beds here in the Grand Rapids Home for Veterans.
Exactly. The optimal size for long-term care facility is around 120 beds. The Grand Rapids Home is now providing care to between 300 and 350 veterans. It's just too big. It's hard to provide good one-on-one care, if you will, for that size of a home. So we're going to downsize that one a little bit and then move folks into the Detroit area as well. And we do have long-term plans. If these models work and they're self-sustaining, and again, these will be financially self-sustaining because we'll be able to access a lot of federal dollars for the care that we're providing to our veterans, which we're not able to do today at the 2 homes. So these should be self-sustaining homes, and if the model works, there is phase 2 and 3 plans where we could build out other homes throughout the state as well.
And how soon will you start seeing action on this, let's say in Grand Rapids, for example?
We've applied this year for the grant from the federal government, and construction could begin as early as 2018.
Our thanks to Senator Hildenbrand, and we'll be back next with more To the Point. It's already the second month of a brand new year, and one of the first priorities in Lansing will be a new budget, as we've been talking about here this morning. Later this week, Governor Snyder will lay out his spending priorities, and of course, we'll bring you that. In addition, we're keeping a close eye on what's going on in Washington, as cabinet nominees are still being considered by the Senate. We'll watch that very closely this coming week, and next week on this program, more about what's really going on in Washington. I hope you'll join us next and every Sunday morning at 10 o'clock right here on Wood TV 8 for To the Point.